Yes, you do.
Do I have your permission to submit this interview to Marion High School?
Right, you do have.
Do I have your permission to submit this interview to Marion Public Library?
Yes.
Just start off by telling me about your childhood.
Well, of course, I didn't. Francis Lee and Mrs. Hutchinson grew up in Marion. I didn't. I grew up in Indianapolis. I came to Marion in 1935, but I was born in Indianapolis. My mother and father were natives there. My father was an attorney. My mother's maiden name was Blizzard, and we were, well, of course, when I was born, when Mrs. Hutchinson was born, we didn't go to the hospital. Our parents had us at home. I lived in an area that was near downtown Indianapolis in those days, because as long ago as that was, Indianapolis hadn't grown very much. We moved to Southport, Indiana, which was then south of Indianapolis by interurban. We had to go, it wasn't a suburb like it is now, actually a part of Indianapolis. It was far enough south of the city limits of Indianapolis that we took an interurban to get back and forth. And I started school in Southport. And I lost my father when I was about 7. Then my mother and I went to live with her parents, my grandparents, who were wonderful people. He sort of raised me, more or less, as my father. And then, so that was at the south edge of Indianapolis. We actually lived on the last street that was in Indianapolis in those days. And then, of course, I went to Shortridge High School in Indianapolis, which was Old Shortridge. Graduated in 1924. Went to work. I couldn't go to college. Couldn't afford to go to college, so I graduated from high school one night and went to work the next day. And eventually went to work for a company called Armour and Company, which were meat packers, which was how I got to Marion, because they needed a salesman up here in this territory. So I came to Marion July 1st, 1935. So that was my introduction to Marion, except that I did see Marion win the state championship in 1926 in the old cow barn in Indianapolis. Mrs. Hutchinson was born here in Marion, so she's lived here all of her life.
Okay.
And see, you went to, let's see, you went to, what was the old town school that you went to on South Washington? Or South?
Town Clock.
Town Clock School. That was on Adams Street, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where you started the grade school. She graduated from Marion High School and went to John Heron Art Institute in Indianapolis
for a scholarship.
Yeah, got a scholarship. John Heron went there for a year. I went to Ball State, went to Old Marion College, and she started teaching school. She was a teacher when I met her. She and I met about 1937. But growing up as I did, just my mother and myself, and then going to live with my grandparents, of course, I learned to work pretty hard early because we had to do so in order to get along. But my grandfather raised chickens and hogs, and so one of my jobs was cleaning out those pens and taking care of looking after the chickens. But I, got along very well. I appreciate all that they did, certainly, in getting me raised.
So, did you have any brothers or sisters?
No, I was an only child. Mrs. Hutchinson was an only child.
Okay, so after you started work at the meat packing plant as a representative in Marion, what happened from there in your life?
You mean when I came to Marion?
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, it's interesting how things work out, because when I we didn't meet, of course, until I got to Marion. And so as I say, I came here July 1st, 1935. I remember at that time driving into Marion from Indianapolis. Coming in, I thought it was the longest, skinniest town I'd ever seen. Because it was long from South Marion to North Marion, but it wasn't very wide. Of course, that's changed over the years. But I belonged, at that time, I belonged to the Presbyterian Church. Francis Lane belonged to the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, who were then at 8th and Boot Street. And there were 4 churches who had a young people's group that met. Young people from each church. There was the Presbyterian, First Christian, the Friends, and the Congregational churches. And that's how we happened to meet, was at one of those meetings one night. I spied her over there, and I thought she was a nice-looking girl, and I'd gotten acquainted with Earl Gottschalk, who'd been around Marion for a good many years, and Earl said, "Would you like to meet her?" And I said, "Yes, I would." So he introduced us, and that's how things got started.
Well, we went down to the popular drugstore rooms and got a Coke.
Yeah.
I drove my Essex
Yeah.
2-door bucket-seated Essex for the last time. And then she was new.
So,
How did your career shape up in Marion?
well, of course, when I came here, I came here as a salesman for Armour and Company. That was in 1935. She and I were married in 1939, and I was still with a salesman for Armour and Company. And then I had to go to the Army. I left in the latter part of 1942 in World War II. Was in the engineers, and was gone from here 30 months overseas, a little over 2 years. And her father was in the real estate business here. His name was Charles L. Carter, and he was in the real estate business here. So while I was overseas, he would keep writing to me, telling me when I came back home, I ought to come into the business with him. So I decided on getting back. I got out of the Army October 2nd, 1945, and decided to give it a whirl. So I went into the real estate business with him December 1st, 1945, and actually been in it ever since. I still am associated with a company here, Century 21 Kilgore Realtors, although I haven't worked very hard lately, but I still am associated with them. The Marion Area Board of Realtors, which was formed in 1947. I was one of the charter members. At that time, there were 16 members of that organization. Now I think they have like 125 or 130, something of that sort. So that has grown considerably over the years. But I'm the only charter member of the original organization that's still fortunate enough to be around. And so, you know, as I say, it's interesting how your life works out sometimes, because we don't know what would have happened. For instance, if I hadn't gotten transferred to Marion, but I did, and it worked out this way. And if we make it until September 9th of this year, we will have been married 60 years. So, we've been very fortunate.
How would you describe the economy of Marion in the 1930s and 1940s?
Well, see, when I came here with Armour and Company, I was making $65 every 2 weeks, and then got commission if you sold so much product over it. You know, you had a quota, and if you sold so much product over the quota, you got a commission. And but then, of course, when we were married in 1939, we had a budget for ourselves, and I think our budget was only like around $30 a week or something of that sort for food and rent and everything else, because we rented an apartment with heat and water furnished for $35 a month.
Wow, good deal.
Times have changed.
Oh, yeah.
It was on Spencer Avenue.
Yeah, 613 Spencer Avenue. Yeah.
Can you describe the company that you were talking about there?
You mean you mean Armour and Company? Or
Yeah.
The meat packers?
The Armory Company?
Yeah. Well, of course, they were a big company. Armour was one of the big meat packing companies in the country. There was Marmor and Company, Swift and Company in those days, and there was a Kingman and Company out of Indianapolis.
Okay.
But the big competition here in this area was Swift and Company.
Okay.
They had what they called a branch house here at one time, and so I had a pretty, of course, in those days, we had a lot of neighborhood grocery stores, which of course are practically all gone now. It's all supermarket business. But I think when I came to Marion, I called on in Marion, probably in the neighborhood of 35 different little stores in Marion. And then I called on stores in Gas City, in Jonesboro, Fairmount, Summitville, Alexandria, and but of course what we sold, it was meat products. In other words, everything from the beef, pork, packaged goods, there was all the products that the meat packers have. And Armour had a big packing plant in Indianapolis in those days, which is now no more because they operate everything, I think, out of Chicago nowadays, or else Chicago or St. Louis. Because nowadays they mostly call on the big chains anymore. But they were a good company to work for.
So were there...
I could have gone back with them when I got out of the Army, but the idea of maybe being in business for yourself and knowing that you were going to be here instead of not knowing where they might send you next time if they needed somebody.
So was that a large operation? Were there many workers under that company?
Well, yeah, Armour and Company had, I don't know what their employees were in Indianapolis, but they had a big packing plant, and they had, well, let's see, when we'd have sales meetings for covering the state of Indiana, there were some, I think, like 25 salesmen, something of that sort. So they were a big company. They sold a lot of product.
Okay.
But of course, I'd always been, the only thing I'd ever been in as far as business was working with people in some kind of sales, because when I graduated from high school, I went into the oil business. During my last 3 years in high school, I caddied at a Highland Golf and Country Club in Indianapolis and became acquainted with, well, one of the men I caddied for was a man that who owned an oil company called Western Oil Refining Company, and so I caddied for him quite a bit, and he knew I was graduating from high school in 1924, so he asked me what I was going to do when I got out of high school. I said, well, I'm going to have to go to work. Can't afford to go to college. So he said, well, go down and talk to my boys. And his name was Trimble, Jack Trimble. He was a great guy. He said, go down and talk to my boys and tell them I said to put you to work. So I graduated from Charlotte. We had our graduation at night during the week, on Wednesday night, I think it was, down at what was then I forget the name of the hall, what it was in Indianapolis, but anyhow, graduated one night, and the next morning I went down and went to work for them. And I worked for them for about 7 years. And they sold out to Shell Oil Company. And then I worked for Shell until a friend of mine was with Armour and Company and suggested I had to go out and talk to them about it.
So when you were at the oil companies, what was your main job there?
Well, I was operating a service station.
Okay.
They had service stations scattered all over Indianapolis and around Indiana. And of course, in those days, all we did on the service station was sell gasoline and put oil in the car if it needed oil, and put alcohol in the radiator in the winter time. But that, also gave them air in their tires if they needed it and so forth. So that's all right. But I did, when they sold out to Shell, Shell made me a supervisor. So I supervised about 22 stations for Shell Oil Company,
Mm-hmm.
and until I decided to go to work with Armour and Company.
Okay.
When I went to work with Armour, they really want you to learn the business. They start you out. You have to start out on the killing floor, where they watch how the operation starts there, from then on down through the processing of it, like with pork and hogs, on down to where they do the curing of the hams and the bacon and so forth. So that when you got out to talk to your customers about it, you knew something about how the finished product got there. And of course, getting into the real estate business was entirely different. There was still sales and working with people, which I've always done. But the real estate business is like every other business. You have to learn certain things about it. But it's been a good business over the years. There's no question about that.
So during the war, what was your main role in the Army?
I was in an outfit called 463rd Engineer Base Depot Company. We handled supplies for engineering in the field. In other words, like Bailey bridges that they used to build bridges to cross the rivers and creeks after they got into a foothold in Europe. We handled all the pipeline that they used. In other words, they strung a pipeline in order to keep the fuel for the tanks going on through. And I was in this base depot where I was, which was G25 in the Midlands of England, which was a nice part of the country. I was in what they call the field out there, which is where we had all the heavy stuff like the Bailey bridges and the pipeline materials and the pipe itself, and I was a sergeant, and I was what they call a platoon sergeant, in charge of a group of one in charge of a platoon, but we were all working in the field. And we, of course, we got over there fairly early because we had to be over there to get all these supplies that they were shipping over, and we had to get them all loaded or unloaded and stacked and have a count on everything that we had and what we had, so that when the time came that they needed them, we could just go ahead and get them sent out then, which was what we did eventually, because after they got a foothold over in Europe, they needed the pipeline supplies, they needed the Bailey Bridge supplies, and they needed some of the other things that we had.
Can you describe these Bailey bridges again?
Well, the Bailey Bridge is a bridge that comes in sections, and they put those together to make a bridge to cross a river, across a creek or someplace, and they require cranes to do a lot of the work. As far as, of course, our outfit was composed primarily of boys from Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, and there was another boy from Dayton, Ohio, and I were the two old men in the outfit. Most of them were young fellows just out of high school. A lot of them, they were 18, 19, 20 years old. They were all young guys. And I was 35 or so. And this George Ferguson from Dayton, Ohio, and I were the two old men of the outfit. But some of these boys, one thing about the Yanks, they could learn how to do things. These boys, some of them never known how to operate one of these big cranes, but they soon found out how to run them.
So were you around any of the major battles in World War II?
No, we were fortunate. We were the supply people that kept them supplied, but we were not close to where the real action was. When we got into England, they were still having bombing raids, because I say we got over there in early part of 43, February of 43, and they were still having bombing raids. So occasionally there'd be a bombing alert, and we all had places to go to get into places for shelter when that happened. But we were never where there were any real hits. very fortunate. But we worked like the dickens because we had the supplies that they needed, and so.
So was England the only country you into when you were over there?
Well, we got into France. I got as far as Paris. I had to make a trip to Paris with a group of, well, I think there was about, well, we drove these trucks from where we were in the Midlands down to the coast and loaded them onto these boats that hauled that kind of equipment. Went across the channel and drove this equipment on into Paris. Yeah, that's the only time in my life I ever drove a big truck.
So when you came back from the war, how had Marion changed?
Well, it looked awfully good, that's for sure. I don't know that I really noticed that there was a whole lot of change from when I left in February of '43 to when I got back October 2nd of '45, except I don't think there was a whole lot happened during that time that I can recall. But all I know is it looked awfully good. But I could see the potential here in Marion for things to happen because there was like in the real estate business, because there were going to be a lot of boys getting out of the service, like I did, who were going to come back and look for some place to live, which they did. And of course, they came up with the GI Bill of Rights, which was a great thing for servicemen to make use of in buying homes. And the lending institutions that supported that did an awfully good job. And I became an appraiser for First Federal Savings, which is now First Federal Savings Bank here in Marion. At that time it was First Federal Savings and Loan. And I know they made a lot of GI loans back in those days, which made it possible for for a veteran to buy it with no down payment or just a very minimal down payment.
So whenever you came back from the war, were you one of the first ones back, or were you come back with a huge wave of people coming back?
Well, when I came here, I got out in October. Well, I came back on the Queen Mary, and of course it was a pleasure ship which had been made into a troop ship, and there were 15,000 troops on that ship coming back. And a cabin that normally would be for like my wife and myself, they had bunks all around the walls, and that cabin would hold 15 GIs. But we didn't mind that because we knew we were headed home.
Back.
It was a lot different when we went over. When we went over in convoy, and we were on a banana boat called the Santa Helena. And the setup was that we were supposed to have a bunk one night, and the next night we were supposed to sleep on deck. But the guy that I was supposed to transfer with got seasick because he'd hardly gotten on the boat in New York Harbor before he got seasick. He spent most of the time in the bunk, and I spent most of the time on deck, but it was a lot more pleasant up there than it was on the deck, except it got pretty cold part of the time. Because that trip took us 13 nights and 14 days to get over. And we went in convoy, and we had to go the northern route because they were still having submarine problems with the Germans on the southern route. But we had a couple of alerts going over where we had alarms to get prepared, to get your life jacket and get prepared because there was somebody in the area that didn't belong. So all we heard was some noise, like maybe some depth bombs going off in the distance, but we didn't have any direct contact. As I say, I was very fortunate. Well, all of us who were in that outfit were very fortunate. But we did a job that needed to be done. Of course, they've always said there's a right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. And of course, taking a guy who'd been in the meat business for a number of years and making him into an engineer was made you wonder about it.
I met him in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
He put his arms around me, and the first thing he said, after almost 3 years, was, "You're bony."
that was terrible. She'd never forgotten that. But she'd been sick during that war. She was anemic. Of course, we got all the meat over there. They couldn't get good red meat here at home in order to have the kind of food that she really needed, because they were shipping it all overseas.
So what was the role of women like her during the war? Did they stay home and run the factories, or was their main purpose?
Well, you worked at the Chronicle during the war, didn't you? Yeah. She got a job as a proofreader in the Chronicle during the war, which they don't do anymore. They don't proofread anymore. Read the paper.
I know what you mean.
But that's what she did. But a lot of them, of course, did work in factories. And you belonged to a group that were called War Wives, wasn't it? That you used to meet periodically for meetings.
Did a lot of your friends from Marion fight in the war?
Let's see. When I left, I went with Joe Barton, who was a Marion boy. Trying to think the day I left. I remember it was a cold day when we left here. Went by train to Indianapolis, and I think we had. I think there were about 20 fellows from here that went down there that same time together. I knew Joe Barton and his wife because they lived in the apartment under us where we lived on Spencer Avenue. There were two or three of the other boys there that I knew. None of them were real close friends. I don't think any of the real close friends that I had at that time, I don't think I can recall any of them that.
So, whenever you went to the war, did you have a choice of what kind of the fighting you'd see, or did they just pretty much randomly pick what you'd do? Did you tell them what you wanted to be?
Well, they really didn't ask. They just
stuck you where they needed you.
They put you where they needed you. Yeah.
Okay.
I did have a chance. We did our basic training down in Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, and of course we went through the basic training like all of them did. If you got into fighting, like you learned how to fight in the field and how to protect yourself and how to shoot the rifle and do all that sort of thing. You learned it in case you had to have it. And for instance, like Joe Barton, when Joe left here, he wound up in the infantry. I know, but I say you didn't have any choice. They did have a test that they gave you, an IQ test. You filled that out, but how they arrive at putting me, for instance, in the engineers, I don't know how they do that, except that's what they did.
So how long was that? Was the basic training, was that like a long process, or is it?
Well, normally it is. However, they cut ours pretty short because since we were a supply company and they were beginning to get ready to ship some of these materials over there, they wanted us over there pretty quickly. We had our basic training in a rather short time. Then we went up to Granite City, Illinois, where there is at that time there was a big depot up there where we were to get some additional training. And I was even able to bring my wife down there, and she found a place for us to stay, a room where we could room with some real nice people down there. And we thought we were going to be there quite a while, but we were actually only there about 4 or 5 weeks before they called us in one day and said, "Get ready, we're going."
So where was your first destination when you got to Europe? Straight to England?
No, we went, of course I say, we went over in convoy and we landed up in Scotland. We landed at a place called Gourock, Scotland, Gourock. Matter of fact, my wife and I revisited Gourock, Scotland after the war, just to see where we came in. That land looked awfully good when those ships pulled into that
Mhm.
area where we could see land.
I know what you mean. After.
Because the trip over was pretty rough. But the weather, it was a time of the year when the weather was pretty bad, and you'd be on the ship, and the ship would be way up here on top of a wave, and you'd look way down here in the valley as there was water, and then the next time you'd be down there looking up there.
So did you have a lot of fear going into the war, or did you pretty much know that you wouldn't be too close to the main fighting?
Well, we had no idea, of course, where we'd go. No, nobody wanted to go, but if you had to do it, well, you did it, and you just had to have a faith that things would work out all right, which, of course, in my case, they certainly did.
Can you go back and describe whenever you were a child how school was back then?
Yeah, let's see, that's a long time ago. How it was when we went to school. Of course, they didn't have trouble in schools like they have nowadays,
Yeah.
that's for sure. Well, I can remember, just pretty friendly young kid. I think when I started Southport School, elementary school, in the first grade, I don't know, I would guess that the class probably only had about 16 to 20 youngsters in it, in that Southport.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I think we must have learned pretty well, because I came out of there being able to read pretty well and write decently, and of course, I was I finished up school in Indianapolis, graduated from grade school there, and then went to Shortridge High School, which was Old Shortridge on Pennsylvania Street. That was at North Pennsylvania Street, up around North Street. It was near downtown. It isn't the Shortridge High School that's down there now.
Mm-hmm.
And but I graduated. My graduating class had about 385 or so people in it, so it was a pretty good sized class.
Mm-hmm.
But we had some good teachers, some real good teachers.
So what kind of games did you play for fun when you were a kid?
Well, we used to play a lot of baseball, because when we lived in Indianapolis, across the street from us was nothing but field,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a pretty good baseball field out there. We used to play a lot of baseball. Actually, I didn't play as much maybe as a lot of kids, because I had too much to do. There was work to do, and I was obligated to do it. And I know every once in a while, maybe I'd be playing, and my granddad would call me and tell me it was time to come, because they had to do some work with the chickens or the hogs.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good for that part. But when you were in Marion, did you notice much racism or anything like that at all?
of course, I wasn't here during the time that my wife was, when they had the bad situation down on the courthouse square.
Mm-hmm.
I could sense, I think, that there was that going on here, except, of course, my theory has always been, like in housing, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
if people can afford to buy a home, they ought to be entitled to buy a home where they want to live,
Mm-hmm.
instead of trying to tell them, well, you have to live in this area, you have
Yeah.
to live in that area. I never, because I grew up with black youngsters as well as white youngsters, and we always got along fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always just felt that they were entitled to as good as I had, if they could afford it, and if they, would behave themselves like I always was trying to behave myself.
Mm-hmm.
I had some pretty good people bringing me up. My mother was very nice, very good woman.
Mm-hmm.
My grandparents were very nice, very good people.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just was taught at an early part of my life that you ought to treat everybody everybody else the way you would like to have them treat you. In other words, the old golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way I grew up, and the way I was taught. Actually, I just, it always kind of bothered me to see problems arise when maybe there was just because somebody was black, you didn't like that color.
Mm-hmm.
Because that person may be an excellent person inside and may be a wonderful person.
So does your wife remember anything about the incident downtown?
Well, you probably do, don't you?
Beg pardon?
But I don't know how, when they had the hanging downtown on the courthouse square, I'm sure you remember it, but probably don't remember much about it. Probably don't remember much about it now.
Do you remember any of it that you could say on this? Do you remember any of it at all? Or?
Do you remember any of that at all?
The hanging?
Uh-huh.
No. I don't. I
Okay.
shouldn't I? How old was it?
I don't know. I'm just not sure. I don't know. You don't, of course, you do remember the flood and what they called Johnstown because your dad took you down there and held you on his shoulders so you could see some of that.
When was that, the flood? When did that take place?
13?
1913. Somewhere.
So was that like was it a really big flood, or do you remember any of it at all, or was it a very bad flood?
Yeah,
Oh,
but,
yes.
yeah.
Oh, yes. It was terrible.
Did a lot of people lose most of their belongings during this?
I think a lot of people did lose their homes down there, didn't they? And, of course, that's why they named that Johnstown down there, because, you know, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, they had a flood like that,
Mm-hmm.
which did a lot of damage, and so I think that's why they called that area down east there Johnstown over the years.
You could just see the gable and the roof on some of them.
Jeez.
I remember.
So was your house one of them that got hit by the flood?
No, your home wasn't damaged by it,
Oh,
because
no.
you lived up here, up in higher ground up here.
No, I remember sitting on Dad's shoulders, looking across the railroad track at those houses too.
That is most of the interview. Is there anything else you want to put into this, or?
No, I think this is interesting for you folks, you young people to do. No, the only thing I would say is that, you know, as I said, I've always had a theory that you try to live your life the best you can and do the best you can, but try to know that the other fella is entitled to his fair share too. So just try to treat the other man the way you would like to have him treat you. And
We had the first foreign exchange student at Marion High School in
You
Germany. She still calls us Mother and Daddy.
gonna talk about that a little bit on this?
he said, "Would you like to talk about that a little bit?"
I don't know.
It was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful experience.
Oh, yes.
Well,
Wonderful.
tell them how we happened to do that.
Mary Beth came home one day, that's our daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and said, would we like to have a foreign exchange student next year? Not knowing what that meant, I said, oh, sure.
So you had the first one in Marion? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think, yeah, I'm not sure whether she was really the first one, but she was one of the early ones because they hadn't been having them. And I forget who was principal of the high school then. But anyhow, see, this was 64 and 65.
Mm-hmm.
She came she came in September of 64 and then graduated with the class in 65, which was our daughter's class.
Mm-hmm.
We did have one daughter. She was born after World War II. I got out of the Army October 2nd, 1945, and Mary Beth was born December 29th, 1946. But this exchange student we had, her name was Sylvia Sommerfeld when she came here, and we picked her up in Detroit in around the 1st of September in 1964, and then she lived with us the whole year. she and our daughter were just a month apart in ages. And she was interested in a lot of things. They were interested in a lot of the same things together, like music and acting and things such as that.
She said she was from Germany.
Yeah, she was then from a town called Westerstede in northwest Germany. She, now, matter of fact, we just got an email from her this week. She's now living in Hamburg, Germany, is with the NDR, which is their national television. In Germany, the government owns the television, and she works for them, and she does interviews and does some specials for them, and that incidentally she got interested in that when she was here in Marion High School, because when she got here and we took her down to Marion High School, she'd already had more math than they teach at Marion High School. She'd already had more English than they teach at Marion High School, and so there wasn't a whole lot of the basics that she hadn't already had more than she would ever get here at Marion High School. But journalism was one thing that she hadn't had any of. So she took journalism while she was here and got very much interested in it, and that really kind of got her interested in getting into what she's doing now in Germany. But that's a great experience. I recommend that very highly to anybody to take an exchange student, especially if they can all be as lucky as we were with the girl we had.
Thank you. I think that about wraps up the interview.
Oh, I think so.
Thank you very much for your
okay.
Stories.
I can just always just say to people to remember that I have to try to remember I'm not the only person around. There are other people that need some help, and we've always been church people. We've always tried to be very active in our church, and we've been fortunate, or we wouldn't have lived as long as we have.